Namaskar. I am Dr. Nalini Avinash Wagmare, working as a assistant professor at Tirak Maharashtra Vidyapit, Pune. As we know, there are schools of historiography under that nationalist, Marxist, subaltern, and imperialist history. So, under this core, today's our topic is basically related to imperialist historiography. So these are the four schools of historiography: imperialist, nationalist, Marxist, and subaltern. Then what is imperialist history? What is imperialist history writing? Actually, in when we refer the books or some reference things, that time in some time they have mentioned as a British historiography. Sometimes they mention as a imperialist history writing. So without confusing, you think that British historiography as well as imperialist history writing both are same. Then what is the main thing we find in British or imperialist historiography? The most important characteristic of British imperialist historiography on India was the dominance of the political element. Here, British prejudice, the tendency to moralize, intensive bio and value-loaded statement found free play. The writers had little interest in Indian life and economic issues, were only treats in so far as they had political application. Works written were confined mostly to the British period and concerned only with British activities. They always presented the British point of view. So this is British historiography. That's why whatever books, authors, historians, they written history in their writing. They appreciate the British rule, British people color, their race, their culture, their activities, their presence of sense, their knowledge. Everything is they consider British are good in every point of view, and other people basically here compare the Indians, theirs are not good or they are considered as a less superior than Britishers. So these things we basically find in the British history or historians' writings. Short descriptions of Indian manners and customs were included only to emphasize their diversity and reiterate their decadency, because we know that the Britishers rule in India and they everything mentioned in their writing about British rulers, governors, administrative system, even judiciary system, how they rule the India, how they make colony under their rule, and how much they have very important to rule this India, and how they made the Indians as slave under their colonial, how they made the, what we say, under British, the Indians suffer a lot, as we know that. But here the Britishers says that we came here because of civilized the Indians. So there's more points found in British history writing. Only few points related to Indian manners, custom, traditions, or culture mention some history in their writings. So mainly for readers in England, the works invariably contain the thrilling story of the British conquest of India and the consequent benevolence, with the writers and the readers agreeing that the benevolence should continue. It was not strange then that every kind of discrimination was strange then that every kind of discrimination was shown in denying self-government to India by British. So Britishers think that we rule the India, so Indians have no authority or not eligible to self-rule. That points we find in their writing. That is that point to be noted. And another things, imperialist prejudice in Indian historiography had first expressed itself in a series of value judgment on Hindu nature and character. James Mill's 500 Age Account of Hindu Civilization, the second book of his famous history, had the specific objective of provoking that it was rude and that the Hindu excelled in the qualities of the slave. He mentioned that we Britishers superior and Hindus from ancient to till today, they are always ready to work as a slave, not as a rulers. In his book, James Mill mentioned. Even we study the James Mill history, that The trend that Mill said was followed by British historians of India, even Mount Stuart Elphiston, sympathetic to the Indians. Passages making of those in Mill's history, the most prominent voice of the Hindus he wrote is want of veracity in which they outdo most nations even of the East. Winston Smith's work on India carefully maintained the imperialist assumptions of European superiority in warfare, as in his account of Alexander's Indian campaigns. Again, trailing the other British administrators, historians, Smith took pains to prove that endemic political church was the normal political condition of India. The inability of the Indians to unite and rule themselves made the permanence of British rule absolutely necessary. They were constantly reminded that freedom had never dawned on their native land because of uh, no unity in India, no cooperation, no understanding between their own states or rulers. That is the one more thing we find in British history. Then imperial dogmatism and self-assurance were only strengthened by certain ideas and pseudo-scientific theories in late 19th century. The first of this was the idea of race superiority. The Britishers think that their color, their culture, their civilization is more one, and they called the Indians as a, even the belief writes James Joel that the white races are superior to black or yellow was a basic assumption of the confident imperialism of the late 19th century. So here we find that the Britishers called Indians as a colorful people. Under that, they call two colors. One is black and another one is yellow, even brown colored people. And you take any example of Europeans or foreigners or Britishers. They always in one color, that is the white colored people. So their color, their culture is more superior than Indians. That's why they are not, first competition is on the race of their color. And that's another one, there was belief in race superiority and its relation to imperial domination was nourished scientific evaluation theories such as the survival of the fittest by R.N. Masters, race and social Darwinism also find the imperialist argument based on the white man's burden. So here white man's burden that they think that to civilize these African, Asian countries, it's their moral duty to go there, rule there, as well as educate these people, introduce the culture there. That is their moral duty. The Britishers, not only Britishers, some others also think that that's why they went to places and make their colonies and they ruled that one. So that's why this white man burdens theory the Britishers applied in India, even in some other parts of the world. Again, the Christian missionary was culturalistically eager to save heathen souls from the certainty of hell. Ethical imperialism emphasizes the humanitarian task of bringing about good government, education, material improvement, and more elevation of the colonial peoples under the white man's care. In their opinion, non-whites were totally incapable of undertaking tasks of leadership and ruling themselves. Tutelage of the civilized over the uncivilized was thought to be necessary. So here they think that Britishers are civilized one and others are uncivilized one, and they think that even the whites are totally eligible for ruling the state, and non-whites people, like African, Indian, the other people, they are unable to rule themselves their states. So it is Britishers think that they have to educate or civilize and rule those nations in their hands. It was believed too complacently that Indians were unfit for self-government. The British rule was the best for them and that they were happy under that rule. This was the general attitude of the writers. Whoever the writers, you take the James Mill also and other historians at that time, whoever written about India, the most of the historian, governors, administrative officers, they wrote about India at that time. They mentioned that the Indian people are very happy whichever we are ruling on them. So some writers mentioned that point there. And the much of the historical writing on India during the British rule came for British Indian administrators. See, they are not writers actually, but the British have appointed these administrators, judicial officers, other army officers. Later on, while working, they have taken interest and they have written the history on India. And that's why they have mentioned some points related to Indian administration and other things. Many British administrators found a lot of material for history writing. They could be easily able to get material on account of their influence. These were highly influential officers of military and civilians. It is clear that their works basis on original source material. In some cases, they were either eyewitnesses or personally involved directly in the happening. These scholars include directly in the happening. These scholars included Grandduff, James Todd, Lord Machiavelli, William Hunter, Elphiston. The British historians began to take interest in writing of Indians, began to take interest in writing of Indian history. Since middle of the 10th century, some British scholars tried to write history to establish British cultural supremacy. Some wrote to justify British rule in India, whereas some scholars wrote with a view study. Indian culture and institution tried to maintain that it was God's will that British should rule over Indian and civilize Indian masses. So these points we find in British history writing and the historian. Most of the favor their own country's influence on India and ruling on India, but very few good historians who write about the good points related to Indian history and culture. So these are the historians list. James Mill, John Stuart Elphiston, Machiavelli, James Stephens, Henry Maine, Tallboy Spiller, Alfred Lyle, William Wilson Hunter, Vincent Smith, W.H. Morland. So these are the historians, imperialist historians. They wrote about India with various topics. Let's see the James Mill's history. James Mill was a Scottish historian, economist, political theorist, and philosopher. He is counted among the founders of the Ricardian School of Economics. He also wrote the history of British India. So he was the first writer to divide Indian history into three parts, like Hindu India, Muslim India, and British India. A classification which was proved surpassingly influential in the field of Indian historical studies. History of Hindu and Muhammadan, also written by James Mill. See, because of James Mill history, from beginning to up to 11th century, he wrote about this period considered as the ancient India. Then 10 or 11 to up to the death of Aurangzeb, that 1707, considered as a medieval India. Then 1600 to up to the independence 1947, then that period considered as a modern India. So whatever James Mill divided the Indian history into three parts, Hindu, Muslim, and British. But nowadays we call that one as ancient India, medieval India, and modern India. So this division created the confusion among the people, controversials, attached to sentiments, and now taken the shape of also religion. As a historians, we have to think that according to chronology, we have to study the history. That point we must be noted in our mind. Then second one is Mount Stuart Elphiston. Mount Stuart Elphiston was a Scottish statesman and historian associated with the government of British India. He later became the governor of Mumbai, where he is credited with the opening of several educational institutions accessible to the Indian population. But whatever he wrote history, he only appreciated the history of the British rule. Then Eliot and Johnson, this both the British, both the government and the people were more inclined to take Mill's and not Elphiston's view of the historian. The Great Revolt of 1857 thought was a further proof of the validity of Mill's argument. He was Henry Eliot who did more than anyone else to persuade the tradition of Mill. A product of the Helbery College, Eliot rose to the Chief Secretary in the Government of India's Foreign Department. So what Eliot done is that learning Persian, he devoted all his spare time to collecting the chronicles of the Indo-Muslim analysts of the Sultanate and Mughal periods. Selection from this were translated and published between 1867 to 1877 in 8 large volumes, that is the history of India as told by its own historians. So this book, it was a project in which he received the help of John Towson, professor of Hindustani at the University College London, where the history of India is told by historian. So here the Sultanate and medieval periods history given in a detailed manner. Then Thomas Machiavelli. Machiavelli, returning from India, had caught the popular attention of explaining British ascendancy in India in terms of British national character in its highest examples. He endeavored to demonstrate how individual character molded history. The fact of a few Englishmen gaining an empire in India was for him a theme which could easily be written in biographical form. Macaulay's essay on Clive drave the picture of the founder of British Indian Empire in heroic proportions. So, history of England, essay on Clive written by the Macaulay, which give a lot of information about the governor of that period and their administrative systems. Then James Stephenson was an English lawyer, judge, writer, and philosopher. One of the most famous critics of John Stuart Mill, Stephen achieved prominence as a philosopher, law reformer, and writer. His book Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity sought to give a rule in India, give a firm moral basis to the British rule in India. Stephen's moral argument was that the essential function of Britain in India is similar to that of ancient Rome's in Mediterranean world. So, administrative system of the British rule and Indian people's political situation mentioned in his book by this historian James Stephen. And Henry Maine, he was also author of Ancient Law and law member in India 1861 to 1869, was not strictly a historian, but his interest in forming an important view of the Indian history was great. Maine fully accepted the Aryan theory and believed that even the Indian village community was an Aryan institution, surviving in full vigor. But he employed the theory not in India's favor, but only as a justification of British dominion. The notion of the common racial stock served only to less racial prejudice and render the government of India by the British user. So, British point of view, again, he was a wrote about India. Then J. Taylor, Wheeler, another administrator, historian, further demonstrated that the attempt to write philosophic history of the basis of the new knowledge derived from Sanskrit studies would reach the conclusions as rigid as those of James Mill. Wheeler was Assistant Secretary to the Government of India's Foreign Department and later Secretary to the Chief Commissioner British Bureau. His 5 volumes, History of India from the Earliest Times, blamed India's failure to develop nationalities on the tyranny of the Brahman priesthood. Madras in olden times also written by him. Then Alfred Lyle is known through his 2 series of collected articles, Asiatic Studies, and an expanded set of lectures, The Rise and Expansion of British Dominion in India, 1894. Liberal in outlook and interested in India's religion and culture, Lyell's aim was to correct certain misconceptions about India in England. So that was the one good work done by him. Then William Wilson Hunter, intelligent, persuadable, and able. William Wilson Hunter was the leading British historian of India in the last 20 years of the 19th century. Hunter's earliest book on India, Annals of Rural Bengal, makes him a pioneer in economic studies. His Indian Musalman is a proof of his unusual insight into the mind of Muslim community in India. He edited the Rulers of India series and the Imperial Gazetteer took shape under him. But Hunter's most important historical work was his History of British India. He died on the eve of completing the second volume of this book, but this gives information about British rule in India. Vincent Smith book, he produced his famous book Early History of India, incorporating the advances made in the knowledge of India's past. In 1990 appeared the Oxford History of India. In the interval between the two books, Smith also wrote the History of Fine Art in India and Ceylon. Again, both the early history and the Oxford history were great success as standard textbooks in Indian colleges and universities. To understand the ancient Indian book, most of the people refer the Vincent Smith book. Then another last one is the W.H. Morland. Maybe looked upon as the last important British administrator, historian of India. He wrote in his From Akbar to Aurangzeb, strictly from the economic point of view. Morland's first book, Agriculture of the United Provinces, was followed in 1911 by the Revenue Administration of the United Provinces, even the Agrarian System of the Muslim India, which is a reference book for the medieval Indian purpose. Till today also most of the historian scholars use this book for reference to teach about the Mughal period and their administrative system. Then directly we go to the what was the overview of this imperialist historiography on India. Western assumptions regarding India's past, change in the nature of British historiography, justification of the continuous British rule. So here we find dominance of the political element of the British people. They everything written about the political British superiority point of view, British administrative point of view, British rule is good and it's a God gift for the Indians, and because of Britishers, the Indian became civilized, educated, learn the things. So most of the historian focus on British point of view. Some are mentioned culture, tradition, economic, and some history related to medieval period up to the Delhi and Sultan Shahi period also. So this is the imperialist history, but they not we just say that they are prejudiciously wrote the history of India. Their history is very good point. History point of view, it's good, but some partiality done by these historians, we can say at last. So thank you very much. Before that, you also refer these books: History of History, Writing Bands, Essential Histories and Historiography in Modern India, B. Shekhali History's Theory and Method, then Bhandakar Research Methodology in Social Science. These are very reference book you can refer, and whichever the authors, as well as the James Mill, Morland, others authors what I have mentioned, these books are available in the library. Even e-books are also available. You can download and you can refer and you can get the knowledge more related to this topic. So very briefly I have explained about the imperialistic or British historiography in India. Thank you.